So we always start these off like we don't know what's going on, but clearly we're on, I believe, episode 16 right now. We took a little bit of a break, a little hiatus at the end of the year, and then I got sick as a dog with this flu that's going on that I'm just finally getting over. So I had to come back to you guys with a banger of an episode with Chris Roache of Ace Intelligence and Investigations. You are a private investigator. You've done some work for me and you've done an amazing job. And one thing is that we're going to change up from some of our other episodes is I feel like I don't give our guests a proper introduction. So a little bio about Chris. He's a president and principal investigator of Ace Intelligence and Investigations, is passionate about uncovering the truth with innovation and tailored solutions. With a bachelor's degree in criminology from Florida State University, Chris began as a security analyst for a major international beverage company where he gained experience in corporate security and investigations. After becoming a licensed private investigator in Florida, he joined a boutique investigative firm in Tampa, Florida, refining his skills in surveillance, accident investigations, and background checks. And now he has founded Ace Intelligence and Investigations based out of St. Petersburg, Florida, to provide cutting-edge confidential services in West and Central Florida using the latest and greatest tools and technology. So without further ado, welcome, my friend. Happy to have you here. We will put away our little devices. We're going to get right into it. So what made you want to become a private investigator?
Oh, it's kind of a long story. I think with a lot of people, at least for me, I sort of always had an inclination that I wanted a non-traditional job. And, growing up, movies like James Bond, shows like Burn Notice, people dressed in snappy clothes, driving nice cars, solving mysteries and helping people was always sort of a cool thing to me, but kind of a dream in a way. And then, going into school, I had designs on potentially going into law or law enforcement, started in criminology and criminal justice. And from there, realized that the more I was in school, the less I wanted to be doing school for longer than I had to. I was always kind of a hustler, had jobs at a young age, and was always trying to work. And I think the big turning point for me was when I was in school. I had a family member. It was actually my dad, who is an entrepreneur, has a very successful construction business, had one of his longtime employees embezzle like a 7-figure sum from the company. So I think it was in the low millions range, but enough to seriously hurt the company. They had to uncover sort of the web of fraud that she had gone through to, hide the money, shift it into different accounts. And, this wasn't necessarily a thing they were going to bring to the police. This was like, a middle-aged lady, works for a company, no criminal record. They had to have their own forensic accounting, forensic audits, and that resulted in them having to hire a private investigator. And when my dad kind of explained all this to me, he was like, yeah, we basically hired a PI. He followed her around, found out she owned a property over in, Port Charlotte, found out she was having an affair with some guy who she was also, funneling money to, found out she was doing all this stuff. And I was like, wow, you paid a guy to do that? He's like, we paid him very well to do that. And, we got all this information. And, I should also say they were able to recoup fully and, his company's doing better than ever. But that was one thing that I thought in the back of my mind. They needed someone to help them. They couldn't necessarily go to traditional law enforcement route. They needed somebody who was going to really get into the weeds and find everything they needed so that they could recoup as much of their losses as possible. And that just kind of stuck with me. And then cut back to college, I'm probably in about my senior year now, and all the guys in my, study group that I'm in classes with, all of them seem to be going in completely different directions than, criminology, criminal justice. One of my good friends went into law enforcement. One of my friends went out and he's also a personal injury attorney down in South Florida. Shout out Daniel Fermansky. You've done some work with him as well.
Nice. South Florida's the Wild West, man.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I grew up in Miami.
Okay.
So I had a lot of experience with that. Obviously, that's sort of an aside from what we're talking about. But the reason I got into it, so I basically was doing some research. How can I apply my degree if I don't want to go into law enforcement, if I don't want to go into, law school, go down that road. I've always had an entrepreneurial spirit. How do I monetize this thing I've been working on for the last
The skill set, yeah.
Exactly.
Which is probably a question for a lot of college kids.
Right. And I enjoyed the coursework. I really did. And, I've always been sort of a contrarian in the sense that, I knew if I went into law enforcement, there would be sort of the rigidity of that industry keeping me in check in a way. And, I think it affords some freedoms, but it also is a trade-off. And, I always wanted a family. I wanted to be able to kind of have my own time. Time was really the most valuable thing for me. And then I stumbled upon, PI work, and in the back of my mind, the stuff my dad had told me about the PI that worked for him years prior, that sort of kind of clicked in my head. And I did as much research as I could, found out how I could do it in Florida, and, basically started while I was in college building a plan on how I was going to do that. And, I came to find out it was kind of difficult to get into the industry, especially somebody,
Can you talk about that? Talk about that. What difficulties or what kind of walls did you have to jump over to get there?
I think that the PI industry as a whole in Florida can be broken up into 3 groups. The largest group being people that have worked in law enforcement or the military or military intelligence, federal law enforcement, state, local, anything. Typically, they have a 25-year career, and then they get their pension, and, they're paid for the rest of their life. A lot of these people are maybe 50, maybe a little younger, maybe a little older. As you know, I mean, it's still plenty of fuel left in the tank.
You got a long life ahead.
Exactly. Yeah. So a lot of the people that get into PI work, naturally, they worked in investigations, they worked in security, something like that. So they transition, they get their license because they had the experience. You get to jump ahead of the Florida requirement where you have to have 2 years of like a probationary period where you're
really
working for a private investigator.
You can just apply for your license.
You apply for your license and you're good to go. Then, you get the journeyman's, so to speak, license, which is the C license. And that allows you to basically be a private investigator. If you want to take clients and do work for yourself, you have to get an A license, which gives you a right to like run your own agency, like a law firm or, a corporation behind you. You can't just be like a gun for hire. If you just are the C, you have to be working for an agency.
So it's kind of like almost like real estate. Like you have to like work.
Brokerage.
Yeah, you have to work for a brokerage, or you can be a broker and then you run the show.
Exactly. So, I was able to, because of my education, as long as you find someone to sponsor your license, I would have only had to do 1 year of that sort of trial period. But you have to be working 40 hours a week, full time for a year. And they have to be giving updates on what kind of work you're doing and your proficiency to make sure that the licensing board will grant you your license. Now, prior to that, I had to take a test and a 40-hour course and all that to be able to.
So it's significant.
License. Yeah, I mean, there's states that require no barrier to entry to get it. So, and I think that that's probably to the detriment of the industry.
Of course.
I've tried to work with people in like a state like Colorado where they don't have like any real licensing or barrier to entry to be PIs. And you're kind of, you talk about the Wild West, that really is the Wild West.
I was going to say.
Find somebody, and the biggest key for finding those people is going through professional networking organizations. And, you talk to a few people and but without licensing, you don't really know who's got what, you kind of just go off of what their listed services are on their website. And that brings me to my next point is a lot of PIs don't have websites just for the nature of the business. But the process for me specifically was, I was able to get that license, test in, but I didn't have a sponsor. I was still working at the time for Coca-Cola Beverages Florida, which is the Florida bottler that
of course
disperses. I worked in the security department there. My manager was a PI. She knew I was interested in it, so she kind of helped me,
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. That's awesome.
All that. And she was like, if it doesn't work out, you at least have that and, you can fall back on it. And at a certain point working there, I think we were doing some firearms training one day and a PI was doing it. And I had asked him, how do I get involved? Are you looking for someone I could just work part-time? I just wanted to get the license. I wanted to get in the game. I would still work and do whatever. And he was like, no, I'm kind of just a one-man show. A lot of people are, but you should come to this, networking group I'm in called FALI. It's Florida Association of Licensed Investigators, and, meet some people. Maybe you'll find somebody that you can kind of connect with there. So I took him up on the offer. I went as his guest to like a luncheon speech event that they had in Tampa, sat next to a guy who ended up being my boss for the next several years. We hit it off really well, and he hired me. I worked for him for several years, and that's sort of how I got in the business. He sponsored my license for the first year, and then I was able to get my full-fledged license and then continue to work with him. Really started from the bottom and worked my way up.
Now we're here.
There. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What type of, I guess, training, like what is it, just like you just learn as you go on the job? I mean, how obviously you did the 40-hour course and it seems like a couple different things, but like how do you train to be a private investigator?
Like most jobs, it is really the training comes when you start working there. And, you have mentors that either you work for or people through, or networking groups and organizations that kind of, take you behind the curtain and show you how they've done it. I was lucky and very fortunate to work for some guys that had done it for a long time. And like I said before, a lot of PIs are these guys that, this is really a second career for them. They're technically already retired. So they just work for themselves and they kind of bounce around, take jobs when they want to. They have the luxury of doing that. And that's what originally attracted me to the job. When I was back in college looking into why I wanted to be a PI, just hearing things like, oh yeah, you work sometimes 7 days and then you're off for a few days. It's like kind of just work when there's work. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. But
what type of training do you need in order to become sufficient and expertise?
I think what it is
private investigation.
So you have to keep building on your skills in a way of either through the mentorship, through working experience, and then through going to continuing education programs. This is a business where you can really fall into a niche. I think cybersecurity is becoming extremely relevant and prevalent.
Very much so, yeah.
Business. And, if that's your thing, you want to be taking courses. It kind of falls on you to educate yourself and find places that are credible that can educate you on that. Same thing with, surveillance. You want to learn from a guy who's really good at it and done it from a long time. And, background research. I worked for a guy who was like one of the best researchers I've ever, worked with. If it was social media background stuff, he had all the tricks, and I would sit at his desk and, take notes and work with him. And he would kind of give me challenges and how to do cases, because we have access to some crazy databases that give you a lot of information very quickly. And sometimes it can do a lot of the work for you pretty quickly, but he would always harp on, hey, do this using only ways of open source research methods, and then, run the data. So, it's a lot of teaching yourself. And I spent a lot of time, just listening and observing the people that I worked with. It was a pretty good sized company that I worked for, not one of these major just churn and burn surveillance companies. Luckily, they had a robust caseload and clients. So I did a little bit of everything, and I got a lot of exposure very quickly, and that benefited me in terms of my training. And I still go out, a couple times a year and do these training seminars, whether it's, for business development or a certain skill that I'm trying to develop for the industry and be better for my clients, or a niche that I'm trying to work on. I mean, for example, right now, one of my mentors is hopefully going to be getting me more work doing jury selection. So
nice.
That's sort of a niche service that he offers, and I've always been interested in it. And it's kind of a cool sociological analysis combined with research, and it also doesn't pay too bad either. So
it's not too bad. $1 million question right here. There's a big one. How do you know you're being followed?
How do you know you're being followed? Well, this is one thing I think I'm always cognizant of. There was actually an instance at my old condo that I lived at where I pulled up from grocery shopping one night and I saw a van parked backed in one of the guest spots, and then another van, similar color, parked in one of the other guest spots sort of diagonal from each other. First sign is completely blacked out windows.
Okay.
So, you're thinking this is either a limousine
So it
or
is
this
like
is
the
a
movie.
private investigator.
Yeah, it is like the
So
movies.
I clocked it immediately. So I would say that's one thing. If you've got a car that doesn't usually, sit around in your neighborhood and they've got completely blacked out windows, that's one telltale sign that somebody's probably watching the area. Now, that being said, sometimes, when you're doing a case like this, sometimes you park somewhere significantly farther from where you're actually looking, but just with a vantage point. So, people needn't worry as often as they may think when somebody's sitting maybe right out front of their house. You'd be pretty shitty at your job if you were sitting right out front of the house you were watching. So a lot of times, people see that and they're like, what are you doing out here? You kind of give them sometimes a pretext. Sometimes you shoot it to them straight, depending on what the case is. But that's the biggest thing in terms of somebody following you. It's usually somebody in a car, and they usually have blacked out windows.
Do you wear disguises?
I have in the past. I've done cases at like beach resorts. So, that pretty much means I wear a bathing suit and like a tank top and go.
You're not wearing the garb that you're in today with the jacket and everything like that.
I don't.
James Bond style. So
yeah, I do. I've done some cases on construction sites. So I've got a hard hat, safety goggles, vest.
That's awesome. I've seen that. Yeah, on your social media.
Video about that one. Yeah. It's just funny. I think the biggest thing, especially with me, if you just go into a place and sort of act like you belong, people don't really ask questions. I also benefit from being young and kind of having this everyman look. I don't look like a typical private investigator. People are usually pretty surprised when they ask me what I do for a living, and I tell them, and they're like, whoa. Just because it's not really a traditional job, or it's a job that's really dominated by people that are retired, police officers, and they tend to have a look. Which also brings me back to what I was saying before, is the people that make up the industry. You've got those retired folks, and then you've got people that I like to call second career housewives, where it's, sometimes it's not always women, but people that have had a job doing something else, but they've always thought the PI stuff was cool. So in their 40s or 50s, they switch and they become PIs. And some of those people are some of the best. My assistant associate investigator, she got into the business about 5 years ago, and she was in a completely different field, but it actually her skills lend well to what we do, especially for accident investigations, property investigations, because she has a background in those things. So, anybody could really be a PI. And when I say anybody, you would think, it's just got to be somebody with law enforcement experience. But a lot of times, and I've had people tell me this that were former law enforcement, they say that sometimes cops are the worst PIs to train just because they're stuck in their way of doing things, sort of in the box of conducting an investigation through the rules of a law enforcement, where, we don't really we have rules, but we don't necessarily have to stay within those same
confines. Confines. Yeah.
And then I guess the third would be somebody like me who just gets in it early, which the guy that hired me, I think that's why he took a liking to me, is because he also started, in his 20s, and he built a great business, and, he saw, I think, a little bit of himself in me. I think we make up a much smaller portion of the industry. I tend to be one of the youngest people at these, state and national networking events that I go to. Certainly, probably one of the youngest agency owners in Florida, certainly in Tampa.
So a lot of people, we've all watched it, are familiar with the show Cheaters. Okay. So, which is kind of brings me, I got to ask about the infidelity and things like, and go down that track a little bit. Shame on me. And we try to keep this podcast clean, and, we're going down the naughty route. But do you, when you're doing consultations, because obviously that's a pretty huge accusation, do you ever have conversations with one party and say, hey, listen, do you really want to go down this route? Like, because I can imagine if you make that allegation and then come up empty, which is a good thing to come up empty in that situation, that could be pretty pressing on a marriage. So how does that kind of go? And then on the other side of it, I would imagine there's signs that are common that you're like, thumbs up, thumbs down, this is worth going down that path.
First, I'll give you a statistic.
Please.
The likelihood of, if a female client comes to somebody like myself alleging that their partner is cheating, there's a 9 out of 10 chance that they are correct.
Okay.
If a male client comes to me and asks for the same services, they believe that their wife or girlfriend may be cheating, they're only right about half the time. So women's intuition is usually
Still
right,
spot
as
on.
always.
Yeah.
So that's one thing to consider, certainly the gender of the client, having that statistic in mind. But like you said, certain telltale signs, a lot of times people will bring you the case and they've done all the investigative work for you almost. They just need somebody to actually, bring it home.
Put the pieces together. Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that goes for not only infidelity cases, but cases of fraud or, potential malfeasance with a business partnership or anything like that. People usually, they get a smell that something isn't quite right. So with the infidelity stuff, what I always tell clients is, are you sure you want to go down this road? Because, what you get out of it is going to certainly change the course of your relationship and your life. Exactly. Especially if you have kids, that makes it a lot harder. And the other thing is,
she can't be going to Target that much. Like, no, I was just kidding.
You'd be surprised. But I think it's also one of the things that I tell clients is something like that. In Florida, it's a no-fault divorce state. So whether or not they're cheating, if they're married, they're still going to be entitled to the same, marital asset split as they would. And it doesn't mean they get less or more if one cheated or the other. So that's one thing I always consider. I always want people to be working with a lawyer if they are in a child custody or marriage situation. But I think it's mostly just like everyone. They want peace of mind. And I think it's better to know than to not know. So I'm always on the side of the client so long as, they want to do things ethically and they want to, just get a resolution and peace of mind. And that's all we can really provide to them. What they do with that information is really up to them. I mean, we've had cases where, we've discovered infidelity and it's presented to the client. They may not get divorced right away. It just may be one of those things that...
Yeah, the factor that kind of breaks the camel's, or straw that breaks the camel's back, more or less.
Right. Or it could be the other way around where, maybe they do decide to stay together. But like I said, it's kind of the ball's in their court. We provide unbiased information for a fee. We don't really just tell them what to do with that information.
Fair enough. No, absolutely. You're just, here's the information and, do with it as you decide. Kind of along that same talk track, but not into infidelity, only in infidelity, but looking at, kind of, we'll call them, I guess, alleged bad actors, these people that you're investigating. Do you notice common psychological traits or common characteristics among these bad actors?
When it comes to business type relationships, the people that seem like they've got, they check all the sort of rudimentary boxes of, what they're representing, and they just kind of give you everything you want to hear, and it sounds sort of too good to be true. And then maybe there's just one thing that's completely out of left field, but everything else sounds right. That tends to be a good indicator, because these people, if they're doing it on a regular basis...
So the lack of flaws, maybe.
The lack of flaws coupled with maybe one big red flag that people are willing to overlook because everything just seems...
They're the 9 out of 10.
Right, right. So it's like if that one, and it's usually a pretty big red flag. I mean, I'll give you an example. I did a due diligence for somebody that was building a supplement company, and he basically was in contact with a group that was going to, create this supplement for him as a lab. And, all he wanted to do was, he lived out of the country. All he wanted to do was go see the lab. He's like, hey, cool. Like, we're about to engage in this partnership, pay you half up front, pay you half upon delivery. First red flag, they didn't want it on his company credit card. They wanted the money wired. He said, okay, that's what you want to do. I'd like to just come see the operation.
A little weird, but okay.
But he had had Zoom meetings with them. They had all the plaques on the
It's a
wall.
lot
They
of points to
talked
miss out
about
on.
all these things. Yeah. So it ultimately comes down to the fact that there were issues with their previous companies that they were involved in that lended us to think, okay, this is probably not somebody you want to get in business with. They just want the 10K, but they're not willing to let you see their operation. I mean, they're like, well, nobody's there to show it to you. It's like, okay, well then who runs it? Yeah, you don't need to be there. Give your plant manager, just let him know I'm coming.
Whatever,
for
yeah.
30 minutes an hour. So things like that. And I mean, by the time he came to me with it, he's like, look, I feel off. And I did the research, and it didn't take long to confirm his suspicions. But again, the red flags were there. And, he was just at a point where he's like, I really want to get this going. Been working on this for so long. But, this one thing is sort of holding me back. And he was wise to, seek outside counsel and get, a due diligence background done on these people. And it, like I said, it didn't take very long, but it saved him $10,000-$20,000 potentially. So, these things are always what I stress to business clients, that, our fee of a few hours of research and getting you a report with all of our findings tends to be a drop in the bucket compared to what you could stand to lose down the road if you go into a partnership or bring someone on board of your team that, is going to conduct themselves in an unscrupulous manner.
When you do present bad news, how do you do that? Or how have you learned to deliver bad news?
Always with a phone call.
Okay.
Or an in-person meeting.
Yeah.
Rather than just sending them an email
but
saying this is what happened.
I will say, though, I would say most of the time when people are consulting you, back to the ratios, I would say 9 out of 10 times they're probably expecting bad news. So,
sure. But then again, there are some people that are so set on getting the bad news, and when nothing is there, they maybe don't accept.
So how do you deal with that? How do you deal? I mean, you're not a counselor or anything like that, and I think that's even the bigger question that I'm trying to hit at. Probably most people are expecting bad news. When you have good news, I guess you could say like, hey, your partner isn't having an affair, your business partner isn't stealing from you. How do you have that conversation and say, hey, maybe it's time to get some closure and move on from this?
I think most people are relieved to hear that. But in certain situations where people are just looking for something,
an axe to grind, yeah,
exactly, then it's kind of a more delicate situation where, sometimes people think they're hiring us to uncover the facts that they believe to be true, but we're just unbiased. We're the unbiased party to uncover the facts as they are, not the truth of the client, the truth of, the whole situation. So I think for those people, it requires a little bit of massaging of sometimes of their ego and sometimes of just making them aware that, this isn't necessarily a failure. You set out to do something. You had sort of a hypothesis in mind. And, if we take the scientific method, we tested it and it turns out you're not correct in what you originally assumed. That's not the worst thing. You take that information, reassess, take stock in whatever it is that you're working on that brought you to us and, go from there. So I think it's just people get ideas in their head, and a lot of people, myself included, sometimes, we just go
zone in
one track, there's no other
they
outcome.
did it. No. Yeah.
Well,
I refuse to believe otherwise.
Well, that's unfortunately the situation with a lot of people. So you just got to, give it to them straight. And that's why I think a lot of people benefit from our services is,
peace of mind.
Exactly. Peace of mind.
One way or the other.
And that's valuable to all sorts of people.
One of the things that I am huge on or try to educate my clients as much as possible is the issues that can arise with social media and their personal injury case or their accident case. And there's a lot of issues that can arise. How has social media played a role in the private investigation context?
So when I first got into the business, it was really sort of on the rise of becoming very prevalent in investigations and also in tandem with, legal cases where they would use that evidence. So I sort of got to see how it's evolved. I think most reasonable people that have social media tend to have sort of privacy blocks on their accounts. And, we can't really hack into someone's account and get in there without, them approving us as a friend. So, it kind of prevents a lot of research to be done on a lot of people. So I think right out of the gate, even when you're using all these cutting edge databases, they can only aggregate the data that's publicly available. They can't get through Facebook's firewalls of, privacy settings, Instagram, and so on and so forth. So I think the biggest thing is when you do have the access to that information, it's always, extracting it, putting it in a file, tagging everything, and just keeping it because, like you said, sometimes you may have a client. If I was working on the other side, the side of the attorney that's representing insurance, and maybe they posted something right after their accident, then they, hire you and it goes down that path. Then you say, hey, look, you should probably clean up your social media a little bit. And then maybe they delete it. So you don't know that it's going to be there forever. Things, contrary to popular belief, they don't live on the internet forever. People can take them down. And if nobody has gone in and screenshotted it and taken it out, then it's gone pretty much. So I think that on both sides, it's useful to us. I don't think it is as useful as sometimes people think where we want the full social media workup. And it's like sometimes another thing, they're expecting a certain result. And I'm like, well, here are the two accounts that they have. We checked every possible thing. And I mean, I'm talking about blogs, social media, anything. But they've only got, a handful of pictures and it's all prior to the accident or their profile's private. So, you go down that road and I don't want to call it a fishing expedition, but it kind of is in the sea of people that have social
mining
media.
For gold, really, hoping you hit something.
And there have been situations where, that investment in an investigation like that yields great results and it wins a case or, it helps in, the negotiation. But yeah, I think like you said, you definitely want to temper what you post on social media. I mean, myself included. When I started my business, I deleted my social media. I found it to be a distraction. I just wanted to lock in on my business and do everything possible to keep my focus. Because, scrolling on your phone at the office for 10, 15 minutes when you're, in the office getting paid what you're getting paid, it is what it is. But when your time literally becomes so much more valuable like that, it's harder. But, obviously moving forward, you realize you can use social media as a tool for, getting new clients, getting yourself out there. That's the big thing with, I think, social media, especially in my industry. As investigators, people, you tend to have a shroud of secrecy over what you do. And that just comes with the territory of the job. But how are you supposed to get people to know what you do if you're not putting yourself out there? So I think that's a thing for most people. And when you find high profile individuals or people that are, because social media is a business now, people are on there
100%.
And, I've had cases where, we're doing a workup on a guy who's got, 250,000 followers. He's some fitness influencer, something like that. And it's like, okay, we're going to be able to use whatever they put on their Instagram. But not only that, you're also going to be able to know where they're going most of the time. So I've had cases where you're dealing with, I wouldn't say high profile, but local
not
celebrities.
Tom Cruise, but
people that are well known in the community.
Yeah.
And, they're posting where they're going, and that helps us a lot because if I'm doing a monitor on somebody's social media and the client says, hey, we want surveillance on this state, I can go and say, okay, well, I just looked at his Instagram the day before we're supposed to start this surveillance, and he is flying over to Jackson Hole, Wyoming for, a ski trip. So you sure you want to set up this surveillance over in Orlando that we were planning on doing? It's just those sort of things are an asset to us. It's not necessarily something we can use in court or anything, but being able to monitor people's, Instagram stories, Snapchat, stuff like that through our like sock puppet accounts, that is certainly helpful for us. because a lot of people, they want people to know what they're doing. They want their stuff to be out there. But I think there's more people that are on the flip side of that probably, even if they do, they just don't post as much. And, it's just, it is what it is.
I do because I want people to know who I am as a person. And that's,
Right.
I stopped, like, as far as my routine and stuff like that, like, I stopped posting a lot of that stuff. A lot of stuff now I post on is like family related and car related and a little bit of legal stuff, but not even as much anymore. But yeah, it's funny. People are very much creatures of habit, which I'm sure you've discovered time and time again.
It's also, I think, for someone like you, it could be a safety thing, if you are sort of in the public eye, so to speak, and, doing what you do. I know you've got some nice cars and stuff like that, and if you've got somebody who, or a ring of people that are targeting certain individuals, maybe based on the restaurants they go to or the places they hang out, for stealing cars or breaking into cars or robberies. I mean, luckily where we live is pretty safe. I don't think there's a ton of that. So we're fortunate that that's not like for a place like Los Angeles where that's super prevalent, that type of crime where people are literally clocking Rolexes in a restaurant and the maitre d' is calling the crew and, they're robbing them, down the street, stuff like that. You don't hear of that as much, but on a national level, that is certainly a thing. And people posting about where they're going, you give potential bad actors insight into your routine. And, a lot of times people's routines are sacred.
Look at Kim Kardashian. So, the robbery in France. Yeah, absolutely. That was very scary. Yeah,
it was. I mean, and that happens to people at the highest level like her. So, it's happening to people, I don't want to say at the lowest level, but people that have, means and success, but aren't necessarily
local celebrities,
in the public
as
eye.
you were saying.
Right.
Yeah.
So those people are susceptible to that kind of exposure. And yeah, I mean, it can be scary. So you definitely want to be aware of what you're putting out there on social media and, what you're comfortable with and, what you're willing to put out there for your family and all that. So like I said, it can live out there forever unless, you take it down and you've got somebody like me, maybe that's taking screenshots of all of your posts. So then they live forever in my computer.
Perfect. Big question. Another big one. When should somebody call a private investigator?
I think that really depends. It's not really a catch-all for any kind of a problem. I have a lot of consultations for people that come to me with a unique sort of problem. And, we offer services and, I can get creative with sort of how we can assist somebody and not necessarily in the realm of our structured sort of package services. But there are some situations that you really can't give them the answers that they want, either because usually it's when it rides a line in between a personal civil kind of issue and a criminal issue. Too small for the police to handle, but sort of obviously big enough to be creating personal or financial strife on a person. So I think walking that line is really about more of just professional consultation, which I do. And, I'll always consult with clients from the get-go, and I'm perfectly fine not hard selling services and saying, well, hey, have you tried to contact law enforcement? Or, hey, maybe let me contact some of the people I know in law enforcement. I had a case like that recently where, somebody came to me and they were like, well, I don't really know what you could do for me, but, I got your information. Here's the situation. And I say, okay, well, I don't even know necessarily what I could do for you, but I know some people that really might know. So let me talk to them. Let me formulate a plan and, present you with some information. And, sometimes doing something like that, how do you really quantify that service? I'm not one to be, billing by the minute. So, if I can present someone with the information, I say, hey, if we want to go down this route, then, you engage my services. Up until then, this is kind of put a couple hours into presenting a solution for you. And it's kind of the ball's in your court. So I think working with somebody who's willing to kind of put the working arrangement on pause to make sure they know they're going to be able to solve your problem is a big thing. And I know a lot of people in this business are quick to take people's money and quick to, say they can do what they want and not deliver results. So I always try to, what's the term?
Maintain expectations.
Maintain expectations, under promise and over deliver. So
We're we're wrapping up here, and I think I would be remiss I didn't ask this. Can you give us any of your most memorable cases? Some rough details. And if you can't, I completely understand.
I suppose. I mean, I've got a few that I always kind of keep in my back pocket for,
Fun times.
party stories.
Yeah, of course.
An instance like this. I mean, some of them are not as glamorous as you may think, and it's just sort of funny situations that you get in. There's some that I could talk about maybe off camera, but they involve people that if they were to see this some way, somehow,
they would know.
They could know. So, and we want to maintain confidentiality as best as possible. But there was one case I did.
Oh, we got one, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we got one.
There was one I did. It was, I guess you call it a fraud, maybe a product fraud type case, where I've talked about this in one of my social media videos, but it was basically a company that produced chips, but they only sold these chips in the Florida prison system.
Okay.
But they were super popular. All the inmates loved it. There are various flavors. I forget what they were called, but basically the company that produced the chips, they got word that in the greater Orlando area that these chips were being sold at convenience stores, like quick stop type places. So they came to us to sort of figure out, hey, what's going on? We've got somebody basically counterfeiting our chips. It started off as basically just canvassing places where the chips were known to have been sold. I go in there, buy a few packages, and hey, where'd you get these? Oh, the guy comes with the truck, blah, blah. Oh, cool. Take some pictures, go back. This went on for months.
Oh, really? Okay,
this went on for a long time. I mean, I wasn't working on it every single week, but the case extended for the better part of a year at various times. Ultimately, I waited at a place where there was supposed to be a delivery of the chips. We were going to try and get tag number and follow the truck to the supplier, so on and so forth, follow the product. It ultimately didn't come, but I kind of got a rapport going with one of the quick stop clerks, probably the third or fourth I had talked to at this time. And he was like, I got the guy's number. I came up with a whole fake story. I was like, oh, my brother and I, we're starting a food truck and we want to put these chips in. My brother, he was in, jail up in Tallahassee. So he showed me he told me about these chips. He says they're great. He says they'll be great for our food truck business to sell. And he's like, oh, cool. He's like, well, I'll give you the guy's number who I buy them from, the supplier. So I'm able to kind of give that story to this supplier. And then, it goes on and he's like, well, come and meet me. It went from Orlando to Tampa, St. Pete. And then he's like, well, come and meet me at my warehouse and, I'll hook you up. And I go and I get all this stuff. And then I start really pressing how do you get these chips? I thought they were only available in prison, whatever. He goes, oh, I know the whole stuff. I get them from the guy. He did something, he wasn't supposed to do, but, he doesn't do that anymore, blah, blah, blah. So I was really right there. I'd come a long way. And I was right there. And with so many cases that I've done, it gets to the point where we've presented everything to the client and I say, look, we go a little bit further, or maybe you subpoena this guy. He's got the goods. Just subpoena him for your case and he's going to have to give up who the guy is. And they're like, well, it's been over a year now. They're not really selling them anymore.
No.
And, it was like a one-off. He basically made a deal with the supplier in China. They got a huge shipment of it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then they ran out. And the guy that I was with was sitting on the leftover merchandise, most of which was expired. And so at that point, they're like, just call it, good work. But it's like, I've so many points in my career gotten right up to the end, or I find something completely different, but still worth going down, figuring out what's going on. And if the client's not going to pay anymore, unfortunately, that's where it ends.
I'm so bummed that this was like a bargain basement. They got a shipment, I thought it was gonna be like an Ollie's shipment or something like that. One of those big stores or whatever. I thought it was gonna be like a prison guard had an inn and was selling out the back door. And
well, that actually ties in with a case that I worked on recently that involves a large grocery store chain down in the Keys. I don't know what the status is of that, so I don't want to get too much into it, but it involves some unsavory Key West criminal elements, some selling of potentially expired or tainted foods and other stuff that was certainly unsavory for what was essentially the only grocery store in however many square miles. So affecting a lot of people. And, that's a case that hopefully will materialize into something, but I don't know if I can say any more on it.
Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. So, well, hey, man, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, kicking us off. We're not going into season 2, but restarting us on the Not an Accident podcast. So I appreciate you so much. We're going to have all of your information in the description. So if you guys want to get a hold of Chris, follow him on social media. He posts great content. If you need a fantastic private investigator, he is your guy. And as always, we end, it is no accident that Chris Roache is as successful as he is. Thank you, my friend. I appreciate you. All right. I'll give you a pound because I've been coughing. I've been getting over this. So thank you guys. We'll see you soon. Like and subscribe. All right. We're out.